Hey, welcome to another episode of Grow Your Life. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and I'm here with Rutland Walker. Rutland, say hello.
Hello.
Today, we're going to have a book discussion. We're going to be talking about A Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, the Last Inkling, and the Evolution of Consciousness. And in the back, it says, what has been lost is the secret of Christianity, that mystical truth so easily stated, but so hard to grasp, namely, that human life springs from God. So a lot of interesting stuff. We're going to dive into this book. But before I do that, Rut, tell us who you are, what you do, and why we're both talking about this book.
Well, we're talking about it because you turned me on to it, and I was fascinated by it. We obviously have a lot of similar interests, and so we're talking about that. What I do for a living is I own an ad agency called UnionUp that deals specifically with building trades unions all across the country, and I'm interested in that because it's a great way for a young person to, coming from any background, to earn the skills and learn get the accreditation that they can to earn a decent living in life. And so anyway, so having hired you as our consultant on a number of different things, when we got to talking about this book, I read it and just devoured it. It unlocked a lot of things that I felt. It was one of those things, you're probably too young for Tom Petty, but it was one of those things about like a Tom Petty song that I think, wow, I could have done that. I knew those songs. I knew that song. I knew that chord,
Yeah.
But I just didn't.
It gave you words to something you knew
Yes,
was there. Yes.
totally.
A language.
And it was fascinating, so much so that I'm on to the person who inspired that book, Owen Barfield. So
yes. So, and I'll definitely want you to share your thoughts on that. And so just real quickly, for me, the way that I heard about the book and what originally turned me on was I heard about Owen Barfield, and no one probably really knows his name, but he's written a lot of books, but he was part of a group with J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis called The Last Inkling. And so I guess it was several, intellectual minds, and they worked together. The thing about Owen Barfield is he never wrote any kind of famous fiction. So he didn't get the same type of notoriety that Lewis or Tolkien got. But anyways, the thing that when I heard the author of A Secret History of Christianity on a podcast, he was talking about the Reformation and his book, the idea in this book came out, and particularly the part in the subtitle, The Evolution of Consciousness, was the thing that really stuck out for me, particularly this idea that that when Jesus came on the scene 2,000 years ago, that he had not just a divine impact, but he also had an impact just on civilization and the way that we see things and the way that we act. And that sort of moved through history in the years that followed. But what's interesting about the book is it kind of dives into also what preceded that. And so the book, one of the things in the introduction, we'll walk through the different chapters, but in the book, in the introduction, it talks about the root issue. And it says the root issue, I believe, lies with how Christianity has come to be presented, or to be more precise, how religious Christians have come to misunderstand the message of Jesus. And it's a very interesting thought, and we'll dive into that a little bit. There's another book that I've also recently read called Irresistible, Reclaiming the New that Jesus Unleashed for the World. And it's written by Andy Stanley, and he's really dealing with the same problem. And in the introduction of his book, he talks about this gal in China who essentially asked this question. She would travel 2 hours just to go to church. She went through hardship just to be at church. And then she asked, why, Mr. Stanley, are there people in America that don't even go to a church that's down the street from them? What's wrong? And so his book dives into that, and he essentially has that same problem, which is what have we missed about Christianity? And his approach is really Christianity hinges on the resurrection of Jesus and whether that did or didn't happen. And the case for Christians of why we believe that it happened is the historical case for that and the strong evidence that supports that. And so it's a great read. I love it. But it's a very different approach where this book dives into this idea that that's a piece of the puzzle, but it actually advocates for a different pathway. And so we'll dive into that a little bit. But what are your thoughts on that kind of root problem, and how does that connect with you, just this idea that we have sort of misunderstood, or perhaps Christianity has sort of fallen away from its origins and what it's really about.
Yeah, well, some of the things, as I said, I felt like I knew, but this gave me the words to articulate it. What that makes me think of is my search, I guess you might say, was previously, until I read this, was around understanding the different denominations,
Mm-hmm.
as if that were some sort of pathway to synthesize all of it and to glean some patterns that I recognize in different things, even outside of the Christian faith. I did a several lectures long series from a group called the Learning Company. I don't know if you've ever seen their stuff or not, but I for a while there was like fascinated with it and bought a lot of their lectures. It was all these great lectures from all these great orators from these different schools and everything. But what the book brought to my attention was this idea of consciousness as its own thing, outside of human beings that evolved over the course of time. And so it changed the way that I've gone back and read the Bible, as an example, to really understand it's not necessarily, you can't read it. You have to, we are in the 21st century. And so there's no way you can't read it with at least a 21st century ethos of some sort, but it helped me to understand why it was written the way it was written, so to speak.
Yeah.
And there was
well, and just to tease out a specific example of that it talks about later in the book is, in the Bible, there's a lot of visual language that we modern readers sort of look at metaphorically, but to the people at the time, that was very literal. Like the mountain was the mountain. It wasn't a metaphor for a mountain,
Yeah. Well, and the art, in what he refers to as original participation, which I think is a Barfield-ism.
Yeah.
Just the manifestation of the art during that period, the Eye of Horus is an example.
Yeah.
Just as exemplifies sort of the consciousness of the day. And I guess I never really thought about that. I think one of Christianity's problems these days is that we think we have the answer now because it's the 21st century and everyone else was kind of hunting and pecking around for it, but they never really had it because they were so, prehistoric or Neanderthal or, they didn't have the understanding that we do now, which I think is kind of, after reading these books, kind of silly. It's an evolution of consciousness over time, and understanding it then is not understanding it now. So.
Yeah. So you mentioned the participation. So he breaks down really these different layers of participation. The first being original, as you said, which is referring to the felt experience of participating in life. And the idea being that in a way we're almost like tagging along this journey and we have an experience of that, but it's not something that we necessarily have the type of agency that we think of in modern day. And then the second phase is what he calls withdrawal participation, when there's a shift from a sense of being immersed in the life of others, nature, and the gods. An awareness of separation, even isolation, is felt. A person will begin to sense that they have an inner life that is, relatively speaking, their own. And then the third layer is what he calls reciprocal participation, which is a third phase. Now the inner life of the individual is felt to belong to him or herself in gain of the withdrawal, but also to reflect the inner life of the nature, the cosmos, and the God. So it's this external force. Essentially, the layers of participation go from this external to kind of a hybrid of external to internal, and to a fully internal version. Is that how you're seeing it as well? Does that make sense?
I had a difficult time getting my mind wrapped around reciprocal participation, more so than original participation. It took me a while to get my mind wrapped around it, but your definition there, I think, is a good succinct one. And then withdrawal, clearly, because withdrawal to me is akin to sort of the separation. And so I get that, and it helped me see the separation from God, so to speak. in a different light. But the reciprocal participation, I've gone down that rabbit hole a little bit, and it's still a little bit difficult for me to get my head wrapped around.
Yeah, I think it's kind of this idea that we have our own agency and our own self, and we have ownership of that, but then we also recognize that we are just one within a larger story. I'm an agent within a larger story, within God's larger story, within a story that others are also participating in. But yeah, I think it's challenging to sort of think about it, to sort of internalize it and to understand it enough to communicate it well.
Well, like when he was talking about Moses, and this is not his words, this is what came to my mind, was him grappling with this concept of the divine that was so large, and then him having to go like, what? I have to put this down in some sort of terms. I have to give it some sort of, I have to reduce it down to this language. How am I possibly going to do that? You know?
Yeah.
When Yahweh came to be.
Yeah.
And I really felt that, because I do think when we reduce things down to language, it's very difficult to understand the magnitude of it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I guess that's where it's an interesting transition into Jesus as the Logos, as the Word, right? As a manifestation of words, but in a way that we can connect to and relate to, that I think words on a paper are limited.
Yeah, I got the concept of the Logos from listening to Jordan Peterson's lectures on the Old Testament, and he didn't get much further than Genesis, if he even got.
He got to Joseph. I think that was
the concept of the Logos. Is that which pre-existed, you know, or at least that's my interpretation of it. And these artists and you know, songwriters and poets and people who sort of have been able to bridge that gap and tap into the Logos, you know, sort of extract a small fractal out to be able to explain it.
Yeah.
When I read somebody who's done that, either poetry or an author of some sort, or a great speaker like Peterson or somebody like that, I can feel it. I mean, it's like, it's visceral, you know? And so when he was talking about the Logos, I really got my mind wrapped around that.
Yeah. So one other passage from the introduction that stuck out to me that I highlighted is, he said, Christianity played a pivotal role in the development of human awareness. It's been so central to life in the Western world because of the life of Jesus captured a crucial juncture in it. Jesus can be said to have understood that the evolution of consciousness has reached a decisive moment. He embodied this moment in his life and worked it out to the full, and thereby became a forerunner that others learned to follow. So his example, it really set in motion something that would affect you know, all the history that followed it. And I think a lot of the work that Jordan Peterson has done and others is that we often take that for granted. We don't realize the threads that hold a lot of our society and institutions together, or that contributed to their creation.
Yeah.
So this, I guess from the introduction, the first chapter, we dive into the early Israelites. And so he's giving us a little bit of kind of what's happening there. And so he meant a couple things I'll highlight here is he said justice then meant cosmic balance, not personal rights. This is an example of what you were talking about, how we sort of superimpose this idea of justice, but it was a very different thing then. And the idea that we have individual rights, it was, I guess, foreign to them at the time.
Yeah. And that Jesus came along at a time when when we had evolved to the point to be ready to understand that.
Yeah. Because for them, their identity was a pooled identity. It was a group identity. It wasn't an individual one. And so And I think we see some of that today as we're, when we're younger, we sort of participate in that type of pooled identity. And we see that in our society right now in different groups where people have a hard time having their own identity, and thus they sort of attach to a group, but have a hard time isolating themselves from that group in terms of who they are and what they believe. So politically speaking, that would be an obvious example. Someone may not really know what they believe, but they would go with the party line because the party line is sort of dictating what they should believe and what they should or shouldn't do, right?
Yeah. Or when you're young, you don't necessarily have the self-awareness to go, do I really believe that? Or am I just in the canoe with these people? What do I believe about it? How do I feel about that? Have I ever really examined why I'm doing what I'm doing? And
Yeah.
I did not when I was younger.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, so talks about Israel, in conjunction with this, something else began to be felt as well, because kingship stirred an awareness within the people. They could begin to think of themselves as subjects to a king. It's still in a collective sense of self, one that works from the outside in, though it has different focus to a deity or a mountain. Identity is now found in the form of a living person, a visible king. So as Israel, they went from not having a king, God was, the leader, and then they started implementing these kings, and they became subjects of those kings, and all of a sudden now they have a relationship with this king in a different way than they may have had before, and that creates another level of awareness because of the contrast of who I am and who that king is and what that king represents, which is it's such a basic kind of structure, but it's so foundational to the stages of awareness that we have. Thinking about just a child and a parent in a similar way.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to understand that was not always the case.
Mm-hmm.
I never really had thought about that. And maybe that's so elementary. I just had never thought about that. I'd never thought that there was no concept of self. The I
Yeah.
am is what he called it.
Yeah. Cause I don't remember when, but at some young age, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, we learn about president of our country and history. And so we learned that lesson at a very young age. But again, like you said, it wasn't for this society. It wasn't until they were adults where they learned that type of dynamic. So
I did a course through Landmark Education at some point in my life, and they talked about 3 stages that sort of develop who you are as a personality. And the first one is you're going along like original participation, right? I'm using,
yeah,
because we're talking about this book, but you're going along about your life, and in about age 3, something somewhere along the way clues you into there's something wrong here.
mm,
And that begins the separation.
okay,
I'm not just fully participating in my life. This is a toy. I'm moving along. I pet my dog. There's no real sense of the level of consciousness, because you're under 3 years old, has not yet developed for you to see yourself separate from what you're doing.
yeah,
So I thought about that when he was talking about original participation, because I was thinking about that for my own life, that concept of not knowing you're any different than anything in your surroundings, and then something happening and there being this sort of fracture of that, and it's your first awareness point of there's something wrong here.
mm-hmm.
And then the second one is I don't belong.
Yeah,
Somewhere longer down the road, I don't belong there. I feel sort of alienated. And then the third that develops your personality is I'm all alone.
mm.
So I was thinking about that as I was reading this.
And it's that's interesting. Just I guess the way you describe it, in terms of adolescence and growing up and going through high school and college, that seems very reminiscent of that season of life for us in modern day, going through those tensions.
But I never thought about it collectively, though. I thought, I have children, and you do too. I see them grow up, and I see those, because I have that vernacular and I've looked through that filter. I see those moments happen.
Yeah. And I think we can even look at our society now in terms of different aspects of the society are on different those different stages of reciprocation.
Yeah. I just never thought of it as a group dynamic. I always thought it was a lots of individuals who get their place in the world, and then they go through these stages. I never got that perhaps consciousness itself was going through stages.
Yeah.
Interesting that he would classify it in three stages, I guess: original participation, withdrawal, and reciprocal. And then Barfield, he never talked about this in the book, but I went and read some of Barfield's stuff, his essays, and he talks about the concept of final participation. So,
and how does he define that?
Well, he defines that as the reuniting, but for some reason Vernon did not grab on. Yeah. Didn't mention that, and I've heard an interview with him since then, and I forget why he said that, but he said it just didn't jive with him, and so he didn't include it in the book.
Maybe he wasn't there yet in his own journey.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
Yeah, but to your point about just the group identity versus the individual, he talks later in the early Israelites chapter, clan tombs were replaced by sepulchres for single burials and crypts that held just one or two generations of a family. So essentially, the way that people were buried, he started to see that shift from the group identity to the individual sovereignty.
Yeah, I've seen the pendulum swing between group identity and individual sovereignty. I understand. I was telling you about a book called Pendulum that was sort of a distilling of another group called Generations that was talking about Western culture. Every 80 years makes this complete pendulum swing back and forth between what they call in the Pendulum book a we generation to a me generation.
Yeah.
Once again, I've looked through that prism, and I thought, okay, we're swinging back and forth as we evolve through time. Between.
So, in the words of Barfield, would that be a swing between the withdrawal participation and the reciprocal?
Could be. It would make sense. Yeah. But and then you get to this point where it just becomes ridiculous, which I think we must be at, surely. Because everybody is, if you don't think like our group, then you are evil. We're after you,
Yeah.
On both sides, on any side, really. It's just it's this what do they call it in political parlance? Identity politics.
Yeah.
And I see that. And it's interesting, the book, The Pendulum, if you read that book, I think they talk about alpha voices as an example of coming to an end or coming to the crescendo of the pendulum and signaling that the shift back the other way is coming.
Yeah.
And so I look for those. And according to the authors of The Pendulum, I've forgotten the other guy's name. One of the authors' name is Roy Williams, who I've read a lot of. And that year is supposed to be around 2023. When the group dynamic becomes so ridiculous that it swings the other way, and then of course it swings the other way, and then the individual ethos gets so ridiculous that it swings back. So, and that happens every 80 years. And so when I look at things in the 30s and the 40s, or late 30s, early 40s, where we are now, 80 years from then, I look at sort of the patterns that existed back then, and it was World War II, and everybody come together, and we're gonna get together and form the group for the common good, and we got this enemy that we're demonizing, and we're all swinging. It's happening internally in the United States this time versus the United States versus some other culture.
Got it. Interesting. So, anything else in that first chapter that stuck out for you on the early Israelites?
No, that was good. That was a good synopsis.
So the second chapter jumps into the birth of the Bible, and it has a really great line at the beginning. It says, in terms of the evolution of consciousness, the emergence of written texts that are read privately is seismic. And so this idea that one, the scriptures, the sacred book, is captured, but also that it's read by people, was a really interesting shift. And he talks on the next page, he says, it means that scriptures create new forms of religious anxiety. How might I understand a text without an authority to guide me? And even when such an authority, how can the meaning of text be settled? And that kind of talks, I guess, a little bit about what you were saying, is just the limitation of, words. Sacred writings generate personal disquiet along private devotion. Religious squabbles, and in times to come, wars, even as it heightens truth's aura. The meaning is not quite on the page. It's not quite in the mind. So where is it? Literate people have to learn to focus and tolerate the slow disclosures of meaning. They have to develop a binocular vision that can read words and remain open for what comes through them.
I thought it was interesting in this chapter about, because as someone was raised in a Methodist household, I won't say I was raised in a religious household because my parents were not very religious, and I, up till recently, I don't even know if I would classify myself as religious. I just would classify myself as someone who is a follower of the teachings of Jesus Christ, so to speak. But reading would be something detrimental. The early power brokers in the movement here, there was this concept, I highlighted something here. It says the prophet goes on to imply that those who love scripture may be unwittingly rejecting Yahweh. That's the danger of private piety. I almost say they focus on what's written rather than the relationship with the divine.
And that's kind of, it's this, what's the source? Are we tapping in? It's kind of the idea, people often have said, the worship of creation versus the creator.
Yeah.
And the words can be the creation just as much as the nature can.
Yeah. One of my favorite, what that makes me think of is Richard Rohr's line, Christ is not Jesus's last name. As if to say.
What does he mean by that?
Well, we're worshiping the Christ, that Jesus brought the Christ, and that was not his last name.
Christ means Messiah, so Jesus was the Messiah.
Yes, but the consciousness, he just like Vernon talks about, we're worshiping the trying to figure out how to say this well. The worship is on the word, is on the Bible. It's not necessarily understanding the concept of the Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? And so in this particular chapter, that was one of the things they were concerned about, was when it became written down that people would focus on that rather than the divine.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm not entirely sure. I know I see where you're going with that. In terms of, I understand the challenge of what they were looking for was not what they were getting or what was to come, right? And there was a disconnect. But in terms of what was to come, I think that's where I'm lacking in what you're describing it as.
Well, we can get into it in a different chapter because he does address that. And I've yellowed that.
But I do think, just even the idea, just maybe at a broader level, the fact that when Jesus did come, the Jews didn't see him because they were looking for the wrong thing. They were looking for a warrior king to liberate the Jews from Rome, which Jesus did not do. So in that sense, this idea that they lost sight of Yahweh, of God, that makes a lot of sense to me.
That's a concurrent thing, though. I mean, in the book, and later on in the book, one of the real epiphanies I had was him talking about the concept of the apocalypse, that we've for generations, for millennia, people talk about the apocalypse coming as if it's this thing, and Jesus said, no, the apocalypse is the inner transformation in your
Yeah.
heart.
Yeah. And apocalypse, I believe the actual meaning is a revelation. And so what you're saying is the apocalypse in our heart is essentially a revelation into who God is or who we are, or some combination of the two,
Yeah. Yeah.
So on page on 36, a couple pages into the chapter, he says, but iconoclasm is a withdrawal of this mode of participation, and it unleashes a revolutionary spiritual dynamic. God is no longer to be found on holy hills, it says. By eliminating the possibility of sharing in God's life in these domains, God must be found afresh, not in the inner life of the cosmos, but in the inner life of the devotee. God must be sought in the human heart. It's what people had begun to feel with the changed burial practices and the effect of written scriptures, and now it became urgent. So there was something about kind of these rituals of reading and death that stirred the internal in a different way. And so he talks a lot just about the Deuteronomists, who were, I guess, early philosophers trying to make sense of these things within the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
Well, another thing that comes to mind, not that it's in this book, but C.S. Lewis has a quote, and I'll kind of paraphrase it, but he essentially talks about, he says how our understanding of God is essentially God breaks that. He destroys who we think God is, and then we have to rebuild that. And that's kind of the journey of faith, is that process of understanding God and then being off track, and then it's being rebuilt. So it's an interesting idea that's what's happening in history, is who we think God is and how the depth of which we understand him.
And so I can understand, like I said earlier, about Moses grappling with that.
Mm-hmm.
The concept of reducing that to something that you could even talk to someone about.
Yeah.
Write it down, or you could even put it into words, or sing about it, or anything. It's way too big to fit.
Mm-hmm. And he says a little bit later that what kind of sticks out, it says, the old revelation is entirely reimagined. It no longer refers to a warrior God who fights for his loyal followers. To the Deuteronomist, it implies a deity who transcends all factions. And so this idea that there's a God of all tribes, right? Not just our tribe. Yes. And that's something that, we could probably learn that in modern times, just as Christians, that we do get caught up in these local tribes and lose sight of the master of all tribes.
Yeah, and the concept, and I think about it in terms of the concept of the one, right, of a monotheistic, how we evolved into this monotheistic school of thought. And if there is the one, then all roads lead to the one. It doesn't matter what culture, creed,
Our starting points can start in a variety of places. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I've had discussions with other people about, well, they worship a different God. I'm like, how is that possible? If there is a God, if there is the one, then all roads lead there. Yeah.
Yeah. The way I think that's a bad question of like saying is, do we worship the same God? Or I think a better way because it's very human oriented when you ask that, like, I think the question is how do we best understand who God is?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity has a passage where he talks about, it's not a matter that any one religion is entirely wrong. It's that if you kind of imagine they're describing who God is, some are more accurate than others. Some have some of the aspects of who he is right, but they're missing on others. And C.S. Lewis' argument would be that Christianity has the most accurate picture of who God is.
Yeah, well, Okay, so we're getting off track here a little bit, but one of the things, my neighbor across the street is Hindu and from southern India, and the patriarch of that family was a doctor at Emory. He was a professor of physics, and he's passed away now. And he was a really renowned. I don't know if guru is the right word. I'm probably mixing faiths there, but one of the concepts I really like about is it's not necessarily a polytheistic thing. These are different expressions of God, different understandings, different expressions. And that's how all those different deities, so to speak, came about. And I get that. I don't know if that's contradictory to what you're saying, but I get the different expressions of the one. The way he explained it to me was like the gas burner on your stove. There are little flames,
Yeah.
different flames, but they all lead back to the Godhead,
Mm-hmm.
the one.
Yeah, I think that the challenge there is that in that particular example, you're superimposing your point of view onto his. And so I wonder, the way that he sees it is actually quite different than the way that you're describing the way that he sees it.
Maybe so.
And so, but yeah,
that aha moment, I had that light go on and go, oh, I get that, right?
Yeah. So I think because I think to some degree we can all look at a story or a belief system or we talk about the Stoics later on here, and we can sort of glean or farm things out of it that help us understand from our point of view. But I think fundamentally there may be superficial similarities across the different religions, but there are some fundamental differences when you start to go deeper down. So,
yeah, perhaps. All
right. So, anything else on the birth of the Bible?
No, other than how it coalesced into the written word. I think kind of has always made sense to me that the concept of the logos predating that, pre-existing that,
Yeah.
And it manifesting itself in some type of written form.
Yeah.
So
next, okay. So the next chapter would jump into the ancient Greeks and survey. Essentially, read a couple of the lines from the beginning of the chapter. The Greek wellspring upon which Christianity draws is as ancient as the Hebrew source. It reaches back to a period close to the time of Abraham in the second millennium BCE. Homer wrote about the stories via which the Greeks came to celebrate these distant origins, collected together in the oral traditions now known as the Iliad and Odyssey. They look back to the civilization of Mycenae, which had flourished before 1400 BC. It fell for reasons unknown, and the Greeks, not unlike the early tribes of Israel, began to be known as minor players in the Mediterranean world as the first millennium BC unfolded. And so it just talks about similarities between the early Greeks and the early Israelites and the logos, the word logos, one of the great insights.
Why do you think, Jason, he refers to the two periods as BCE and CE rather than BC and AD? He is a former Anglican priest, yeah?
Yeah, I think the BCE is the kind of the new standard that's used. So I don't know if he considers himself as an academic, but that would be my assumption, is that as an academic, you'd want to use the most recent iteration of that description.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that a guy, an Anglican would use that. But
yeah, I didn't see that irony, but yeah, that's interesting. And the Greeks, so further similarities stand out as the Greeks related stories of heroic ancestors and mythic history, and then adopted sacred writings, so they became a people of the books. Now, what's interesting to me, as I was reading this book, when I was growing up and just over time, my interest in the Greeks was the stories and mythology.
Yeah.
But there is a rich, philosophy history there. It just was never something that interested me. It was mostly the stories. So that was kind of an interesting revelation for me.
Well, the most interesting thing from this chapter for me is the concept of the logos.
Yeah.
I was just going through some of the things that I highlighted. One of them was talking about that. So one of the greatest insights was the notion of the word, or the logos. It became a central plank in the understanding that Christians sensed following the life of Jesus of Nazareth. They also laid down important precursors to monotheism, as philosophers made the case that godliness is akin to goodness and oneness. Kind of what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
The one, the concept of the oneness, goodness, and, light from dark, and that separation. Barfield has a really good way of distilling that on how mankind evolved and began to understand the world by separating it into dualities, and
the spiritual and the physical, is that what you mean?
Just in everything, being able to sort of navigate the world physically or otherwise, being able to distill things down at some point to a duality, which helped them to navigate between those two things,
Yeah.
So that was the biggest standout for this chapter.
Yeah. Anything else in this one?
I forgot, I was so steeped in those later chapters that I've really forgotten some of what let's see what one of the things I highlighted here was talking about Barfield. It said, Barfield, and others have proposed that before the 7th century, they did not experience themselves as individuals in the way that we do. The art accurately depicts how they did experience themselves as facets of a collective that collectively reached into their internal self-awareness. That collectively reached into their internal self-awareness because, as Thesis adds, they did not know their bodies as integrated entities either, but rather a baggy gathering of spirited factions. It's what the art displays. I thought that was fascinating.
What about it stuck out for you?
Well, it just it helped me distinguish how we experience things now versus how they did back then.
Yeah, just to kind of remember, or just a reminder or a revelation of it's not what we think. It's different.
Well, and it affects how you might read something like Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you were talking about earlier, you were interested in the Greek, in the characters and the myths and that kind of stuff, and we think that's this sort of fossil that they wrote back then, or coalesced around these stories, rather than that's how they express themselves as a manifestation of their consciousness at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's not a whole lot of going back to the Hindu example, the Greek gods, those representing the different characteristics, different divine characteristics, and each one had this personality. Each of these Greek gods had these personalities. I don't see a whole lot of difference there, but it speaks to the age of consciousness they were in then versus now.
Well, and he goes on to say that it was the Deuteronomists and the Greeks that were the midwives to a conscious life. And I guess it is challenging for us to sort of entirely set aside our consciousness as we know it and go into the lives of these people and see the world they saw it. Perhaps impossible, but at least very difficult. So the next chapter continues talking about the Greeks, but he shifts to talking about Socrates
Mm.
and the Athenian Moses, as Vernon calls it. So, what stuck out for you in this chapter? Socrates was a monumental figure in Greek philosophy, for
Well,
sure.
the similarities that Socrates, nothing you can't find in your writings of Socrates. People captured that, not unlike Jesus.
Yeah,
It wasn't the teachings of Jesus are written down by someone else. They weren't written down by Jesus himself. And the same thing for Socrates. And there's a lot of similarities there, and he goes into a lot of similarities. And I just thought that was interesting. I back in school, we studied Plato and Aristotle and everything, but I just never really, I guess I never really tuned into that he never wrote anything down.
yeah, yeah. I was written for.
It was Mark, basically, not unlike Jesus.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it's interesting. On page 72, he quotes Barfield. He says, "A modern European can read Plato and Aristotle through from end to end. He can even write books, excuse me, expounding their philosophy, and all without understanding a single sentence, unless he has enough imagination and enough power of detachment from the established meanings or thought forms of his own civilization to enable him to grasp the meaning of the fundamental terms, unless, in fact, he has the power not only of thinking, but of unthinking. He will simply reinterpret everything they say in terms of subsequent thought."
What is that? Why did you highlight that?
I think the idea that, sort of like we were talking about earlier about the limitation of words, but we can read something and completely miss what it's saying. Just as a practical example, I see a lot of, I read a lot of content online. I see articles, I see headlines, and I'll read the headline, and the headline will be referencing what someone said. Like there's a quote from, perhaps it's political or it's in the entertainment industry, whatever it is. But I'll look at the actual quote and I'll read it, and I'll go, man, did they even read the quote? It's like they completely missed what was going on there. And so that's sort of how I relate to this is there has to be this sort of, we have to, one, understand that we do have a bias that drives us and that sort of shapes how we see things. And so we have this idea that our imagination allows us to go, okay, that's one potential view of this. But what are other ways that I could look at this, ways that are different or even challenging to my own preferences? And there is something interesting about having that imagination to imagine the alternative stories so that we don't get trapped in the simple ones.
Yeah. From that chapter, for what it's worth, I highlighted talking about Barfield and the Logos and Plato. He says one would be the word logos and its derivatives. They are often translated as word or reason or arguments. But as Barfield writes, reason is quite inadequate to convey a 20th century imagination, the cosmic process which Plato must have felt to be taking place, as much out in the world and among the stars as within his own mind. That's one reason why logos was such a crucial realization.
And so what does that teach us today? What can we learn from that to apply in our lives now?
Well, it gave me an understanding of, trying to write down or articulate or whatever, what someone was thinking so many millennia ago is almost not worth doing. But knowing that we're tethered to each other through the logos is comforting.
And he also says, let's see, on 74, they offer the kind of knowledge that's gained not by the accumulation of facts, but by uniting them. And this idea of sort of synthesizing just as a writer, as someone who, I love to write, and I relate to that very much, because that's very much what I do, is I'm pulling in all these sort of points of data to create a cohesive presentation or argument or story or understanding. And the facts they're just pieces of the puzzle. They're not the whole story. So
Yeah. Well, words evolve, right? I mean, and so looking at, he mentions this here, talking about similarly the word nous, which often is translated to mind or intellect, words that easily erase what Plato evoked. For him, nous is a receptive capacity, a seat of awareness, as much associated with the heart as the head. So those words that they used and then translated into a different language so that we could understand it, there's something that gets lost there. And he goes on in a later chapter to talk about how Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man, as an example. In Christian parlance, we talk about the Son of God a lot, but he if ever, referred to himself that. He referred to himself most likely as the Son of Man, which was, Vernon did the research on it, following that thread back to when it was written, Son of Man was an idiomatic expression, meaning I'm one of you. I'm just like you.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? To give people, that was revelatory to me, because it gave me a sense that he was trying to say, I'm just like you are. I'm a man just like you are.
Mm-hmm.
I have the ability to tap into the divine. I can teach you to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the club, as I call it, the church has in my opinion, bastardized that. They've separated that, and it becomes less accessible to people now.
Although, I mean, I guess historically, that's a big part of the Reformation, right? Was that a part of the Christian community was like this. We've been separated from something that we do not need to be paying for our sins. We do not need to be separated. We do not have to go through the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah. Well, and then every now and then someone comes along and has that revelation.
Yeah.
Martin Luther, John Calvin, and then, where I came up from, Wesley did the same thing. And people go, oh, he's got it right. And then it's fresh and it's new. And it's like, he's really dialed into the Logos, and he disseminates that information to people and starts this movement, right? And then that movement does the same thing that every other movement has done.
And that, the way that I look at it is it's the human corruption.
Totally.
That the church is not immune, although it has some healing mechanisms over time, over cross generations. It is not immune to the corruption of control and power and essentially pushing people out, right?
Yeah, and those relics that are left behind, those things that we're getting off topic a little bit, but those things that they did coalesce around, those fractals of the Logos they pulled out, like in Wesley's case, he codified the quadrangle, looking in order to make decisions, as an example, looking at things through reason, experience, scripture, and tradition. That's a good one, right? I can get my mind wrapped around that. I can use that to filter out what's real from what's not real.
Yeah.
That's why I think sort of Methodism as an ethos is very much a practical thing. It's not always the most spiritual thing. A lot of people call it a country club, denomination, but I get that piece of it, right? Another example would be, I'm not Catholic, but I didn't really understand the Catholic thing, but I sent my child to Catholic school the last 2 years because of the education quality. And I didn't really get it. And then in order to be comfortable with doing that, I began to read about Catholicism, where I discovered Hubbard, Richard Rohr, et cetera. I think I may have shared this with you, but I got the concept of the almost calisthenic ritual of confession. You know, it became corrupt, and the church became this place where you can't get to God unless you go through your local priest, right? But that doesn't take away from the understanding the benefit of releasing that pressure valve, you know, confessing your sins on a regular basis so that it doesn't become this abscessed thing that, you know, drives you into some really dark places. Like, I totally get that. I think that's a healthy exercise.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that, comes to mind when you say that is, I do think there's, just like following Jesus, and the disciples and the disciples followed Jesus, and then Jesus ascended, and they then they carried the message on, right? There is a kind of a process of, and we have to go through that saying, we usually, as a Christian, we usually follow a person that is embodying Jesus, that is pursuing Jesus as a representative of Jesus. And we follow that person, who then connects us to Jesus. But there is something to those steps in the process. And I think with the Catholic Church and the confession, I think that can be a pathway towards Jesus. I think the danger is when it becomes a gatekeeper to Jesus as opposed to a conduit. Does that make sense?
I agree with that for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's that's the revelation of this book for me was Jesus. I can almost hear him saying, "Wait, don't start another club. I'm telling you how. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish. It doesn't matter if you're Hindu, whatever. This is accessible to everyone. This is for everyone. It has to be inclusive. It can't be exclusive. It could never be a situation where if you don't join the club, if you're not part of this club, you don't get in. It doesn't, it doesn't make sense. It can't.
Well, I guess I would say that I like the word used, accessible to all. But I think as soon as you start to make choices, you become exclusive, right? Like in your marriage, you commit to your wife, and so you become exclusive. So I think there is some exclusivity aspects of it, but maybe not necessarily in the way that you're describing it. But I do think accessibility is for all is highly important.
Yeah, well, it's accessible to all people.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it.
Gift is accessible to everyone. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish. It doesn't matter if you continue to go to the synagogue or you continue to go to whatever. It doesn't matter. It's accessible to everyone. It's universally accessible. As opposed to, and what happens is, like you said, we corrupt it, and we start to focus on, I'm in, right? I'm in the club. Oh, you're not in the club. Right. And it becomes this earthly thing, as if to say, like when Falwell got in trouble a couple of weeks ago, the body of Christ, the Christian community, if we were tapped into that universal acceptability of the transformation, we would go, oh man, Jerry, I'm so sorry, man, sit down here. Wow, that's a bummer that you really did that. It was like almost like I feel for the guy because he fell so far, as opposed to what the church does now, which is immediately disassociate them with him. Oh, we have to preserve the club, and so we have to eschew this guy who fell from grace, who clearly had made some really poor choices.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would add to that is that that he must lean into that. So if he is unapologetic, or if he's not willing to repent and change, if he's like, hey, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to keep doing it, that's one thing. And I don't know whether he's doing that or not, or, hey, what I've done is wrong, and I want to reconcile this and reconcile. But I do think there is a place to not enable it to continue if it is a wrong thing. But I don't think we should necessarily excommunicate people just because of that.
Yeah, I agree with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I'm not enabling him. I'm just saying the initial reaction.
But I do think we tend to want to just like flee from the messiness because we don't want to be entangled in it. And that's, I don't think that's a good thing.
Right.
And I've done that, I can relate to that.
Out with the lowest of the low, right? I mean, unless I'm wrong about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
With the tax collectors and the prostitutes and
there's a movie coming out called Tenet, and in the trailer that there's a line that says, everyone thinks, they would help someone if they needed it, but very few people can handle the fires when you run into the burning building.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially we all have sort of this optimistic thing that we would, be generous and helpful, but when it gets down to it, it's not easy.
Yeah, I would be the virtuous one. Peterson talks about that a lot, about imagine yourself as one of the SS guards.
Yeah.
And everyone says, oh, I would never do that. I would never, participate in genocide like that. And he's like,
if you don't know why the guard would do it, you don't know why you would do it.
Yeah. And understanding the monster inside yourself,
mm-hmm.
so as to distinguish that side of you, that side of all of us that we have, to make a choice to turn away from that or to tame that.
Yeah.
One of the things he was talking about with the misinterpretation of the meek shall inherit the earth. And I'm not smart enough to remember exactly how he spun it, but he was talking about the interpretation of that and saying that's not the interpretation is not to be weak and cower. The interpretation is the person who understands the power to wield the sword but keeps it sheathed shall inherit the earth.
Yeah, and it's it's an interesting idea. I mean, that's essentially when Jesus, when they came to arrest him, right? Peter drew his sword, and Jesus said, "Not, that's not why I came. This is not why I'm here." And so he responded in exactly the way you're describing. But perhaps our biological response to that type of situation is to pull out the sword, right? It is retaliation. It is revenge. It is.
I thought it was interesting that Vernon, and we're getting into a later chapter here, but Vernon was talking about Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
And how he had to discern what kind of, sort of enemy of the state this guy was. This guy, and he, conventional wisdom of the day would be when someone commits a political insurrection of some sort, you would, imprison everybody that was all of his murderous co-conspirators along with him. But he did not see that his concern, that Jesus's concern was not of this world. It was not of this kingdom. And therefore he arrested Jesus, or they arrested Jesus and brought him to Pilate, and they didn't arrest any of his co-conspirators, so to speak, his disciples. I thought that was a pretty interesting distinction.
Well, and the disciples, I think, assumed that they would be arrested because they all went and hid, and they were all, we'll stand with you, Jesus, and then it got hot and they all ran away. But that's, the next chapter, the secret kingdom, right? Much of what Jesus stood for suited the stormy spiritual weather of the first century. So was it in that chapter, or was it a further one about Pontius Pilate?
I don't remember. Chapter 6 was the one that I just
okay, so that's the next one.
Up. Like what I highlighted in chapter 5 was his disciples routinely misunderstood the consciousness he inhabited. They struggled to transition to it themselves, and I suspect the gospel authors strove to capture that struggle in what they wrote, so that reflecting on it might facilitate the conversion of their own readers. To this extent, they were like Plato when he chose to write dialogues. They wanted to convey a revelation, not to make a record. I think that's a huge mistake. It's something that has never sat well with me, when I've been in Bible studies and
What do
that
you,
kind
which part of it doesn't sit, it hasn't set well?
well, reading the Bible as if it's a record, well, and having this um, unconfident stand that you almost feel like you have to defend that historical record
Got
rather
it.
than understand it as a revelation.
Okay.
Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I think, I don't know how, in the other book I mentioned, Irresistible, it's similar to what Andy Stanley does, is he says, we don't need to worry about defending the Bible. It's not the foundation of which our faith rests on. And so in that sense, I think I get it. I'm not sure, I guess where I'm not clear is what would be a specific example of how people saw it as a record and how that bothered you?
Well, I think, again, what's coming to the top of my mind when you ask that question is when I've been in Bible studies before, some of the participants have been in this frame of mind to read it like it's this historical record. It is of history because it happened, but it's not written as a chronological
Okay.
record as much as it is in
Like
order
where
to,
you miss the story that's being told across it. Is that what you mean?
right. They almost want it to be sequential, and I never found the need for that.
Okay. And why did they need it to be sequential?
I don't know. I think
Okay.
it deals with personality styles. Some people have to have that more concrete understanding, and it has to be written out in factual form and all that. I just don't have that same compulsion. I don't have that same desire to understand it that way.
Well, one of the other things too to keep in mind is that obviously the Hebrew scriptures have been around for a while, but the Christian scriptures didn't come until after Christ left, right? So, and they were letters, and they were written around and shared, and Paul's letters, but it was hundreds of years later before it was all compiled into what we now know as the Bible.
Right.
Where
And there were
someone
lots
took
of things that were left out, things that were written.
it was canonized, but the point being is that Christianity originally was around for several hundred years without a Bible, and God still, had his role in that, and it still moved in the way that it did. And the Bible was an effect of Christianity. It was not the cause of Christianity.
Agreed.
And so I think to maybe perhaps even some of the Bible studies you were in, and even ones that I've been in, is I think we forget that I think a lot of people just culturally that aren't familiar with Christianity, is they think of like the Bible as like the thing that created Christianity, when Christianity actually was what created it. Someone put together all the letters, and then someone said, well, Jesus is a Jew, and what did the Jews believe? And so they sort of put all these pieces together. And so we think the Bible is actually the foundation of what we believe, when in fact it's more of an effect.
One of the things I've read about the Stoics and I've read about the Cynics, but I never really put together one of the things. I don't know if it's talking about this or the previous chapter, but
This is the previous chapter. Yeah.
Vernon was talking about how Jesus was clearly influenced by those two philosophies.
Well, so he said two things that I highlighted. He said the Cynics were different. They felt that what imprisons and limits human beings are the externalities of social conventions. And then he said the Stoics taught that the emotional flux of the human mind was the enemy within that might undo you. And so I guess the way that I would phrase it is that those two philosophical approaches started to prepare people's minds and culture for what Jesus was to bring. But if Jesus is the Logos, the eternal, and he's the creator of things, then it would only make sense that he essentially harmonizes some things that came before him. I think of it like, whenever you see a comedian, there's a they have the headliner, and then they have the person that starts, and the person that starts is just to kind of get everyone laughing, and then the
Yeah.
headliner comes on stage. So I kind of think of,
Yeah.
what came before as sort of setting Jesus up, and the stage was being set, right? And not just the philosophy, but even the technology and the era and the time and civilization and so on and so forth. So
Well, in the vernacular he would have used to connect with people. If
perhaps language, yeah.
you know what I mean, if there's a cultural sort of vibe that diffuses across a population.
Mm-hmm.
My son uses the word lit, right? Or
Yeah.
other words that drip and stuff like that, that it means something completely different to me. But I'll use those words talking to him because that's his era vernacular.
Yeah.
In order to connect with him in some way, I have to connect what he knows with what I know. And in order to do that, I have to use a more contemporary vernacular than I would with my father.
Well, and I think what's interesting, the Apostle Paul, when he went to Rome and he interacted with the philosophers, he observed, and they had all these statues to these different gods. And there was one statue that was to the unknown God. And essentially he said, well, I know the unknown God. Let me tell you about him. And so he leveraged the cultural context to share about Yahweh and Jesus, and some of the philosophers outright rejected him, but some of them were like, I'm interested, and they met with him later. So
yeah.
And I assume that's how he started, some of the early churches in that area.
I honestly don't see how this book is not a wildly runaway bestseller.
Well, I don't know. It's something like when I heard about it, I was like, this is interesting. I want to read it. I don't know. I think
it just connects so many dots.
I think it kind of going back to the participation levels, the original, withdrawal, and reciprocal. I think it kind of depends on where you are in the journey. Like perhaps you see yourself in that sort of original withdrawal participation, and this just isn't something that's on your mind. Or you just don't know about it. People may just not know about it. So I guess, we've kind of covered a lot of things. So there's a few more chapters: the Christ consciousness, the Christianity's high noon, reform and science, and then we must be mystics. So this is the last section. What have been some of the things you've gone to revisit in these chapters? What stuck out for you? And
well, him talking about the parables, and us distilling those parables into this kind of digestible little story that might mean, something. And him saying, no, this, like he was talking about the 3 or 4 parables about money, and to illustrate a number of different points. Mm-hmm. One was when he was talking about the king and the 3 slaves, and he gave them 3 sums of money, and I've forgotten the term that he uses for
talents.
Yeah. And what an astronomical amount of money that would have been, and him speaking in that, like when the slave owed the king something like 10,000 talents or something, that it would have been, that it was never meant to be interpreted as a story, right? That you could get your mind wrapped around. That sum of money would have been more than someone in that person's position could have earned in 100,000 lifetimes.
Yeah.
It wasn't about money. It was about, and when he was talking about the 3 slaves he gave the money to, and one, went and invested it, and it returned tenfold, and the next one invested it, did a little bit less, but still returned something like threefold. And then there was the one guy that buried it in the back in the backyard, and he was rebuked for that. And Vernon's point is, it's not necessarily about money. That's the way you could see anything. If you have a natural talent, if you can sing, if you can, if you're athletic, if you're musical, if you're a great writer, if you've got this talent that is given to you, that you inherited from the divine, there's no way, you must be that way with writing. You've cultivated it, but there's something in you that's different than someone else. That's a natural talent that you have. If you don't use that and invest it, and it won't pay you back. It's not, that's the point, is to use the gifts that God gave you. It's not necessarily about money. That was one of the big things that, talking about the Good Samaritan in the same way, that his thing was indifference to money. It wasn't
helping the person was more important than whatever it cost to help them.
That he anointed him with oils that would have been a year's salary for the guy. But he was indifferent to it. The money, in other words, are illustrating the point of, it's not money that's evil, it's the love, the attachment to it as an earthly resource that's evil.
So when I think in the last chapter, it's labeled, we must be mystics. The way forward, he phrases it, the way forward, I believe, is to return to the centrality of the religious experience, the intuition that there's more, and the realization that Christianity, alongside other wisdom traditions, can make surprisingly felt sense. He goes on to talk about imagination and story and all around that idea of this experience. And the thing that has brought me back to this chapter recently is because we are living in a post-truth era, post-science, and the chapter before this is on science and reform and talking about how that played a role in the evolution of society, and but in the same way, I feel like there are a lot of people that whether it's political or religious or whatever, they believe what they believe. They are anchored in that, and there is no reasoning them out of it. There is no debating out of it, but there is a place that story, parables can pierce through those defenses, those walls, to actually reach people that are stuck in those paradigms or whatever it might be. And that's that idea of, okay, how do I reach people in a post-truth world, when it's not about having a good argument, it's a matter of whether they like the conclusion of the argument or not.
My way of saying that is, you can't convince someone who's convinced. They're not in a place to hear you. If your wife or your friend or someone is super dogmatic about a point and they're just pounding it home, you might as well just turn the other cheek and talk about something else, because there's no way you're going to get your point across. They don't want to hear it. They're convinced. They're closed. They're convinced. There's no way so you'd have to do something. You'd have to use some sort of literary vehicle, like a parable.
And I one example is, and I think it has, in many cases, it has to be from within. And what I mean by that is, if you're, let's say it's politically, right? And so if you're trying to talk to a Republican about an issue, to just debate it isn't going to get you anywhere. But if you were to say, I used to be a Republican, and this is my experience, and this is what I learned, and where I failed, I have more, I think I'm heard more than if I don't have that story, if I don't have that experience, if I can't relate to them in the same way that they feel in that moment, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Or any situation,
That's the concept of enrolling. I cannot get my point across until I can articulate your point to you, to your satisfaction, so that I get what you're going through.
I want to be heard and acknowledged, I think, more than anything, or we as humans want to be. Right? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, for sure. But we can't hear it unless unless we get that unless we enroll that other person in us having gotten that.
Yeah. And I think that's with stories and parables. You don't have any of those cultural toxins that get attached to words or ideas or thoughts. With a story, everyone's kind of having to start over. They're having to think through it. I'll give you a practical kind of parallel. When I've done movie extra work, I was on The Founder with Michael Keaton, and it was in the 50s and 60s. And so we all went on set, and then we had to get the costumes on. Everyone on set, had a new wardrobe. And so nobody knew anybody or their background or anything. So you might be sitting next to like a millionaire entrepreneur that's doing a casting call, and you might be sitting next to like a college student that's starving, but nobody knew the differences. And so you have to start over. You have to have that conversation. You have to get to know each other, and you learn who they are. And so I think in that same way, stories allow us to sort of have that reset where we can engage with people without having this baggage that pulls us down.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have two things that I want to ask you about specifically based on the conversation that we've had, because I enjoy hearing the different take that you have from what I have. But there were a couple of really revelatory things in this chapter. I guess it was chapter 6. And I want to read them to you real quick, and I want to get your thoughts on it. One is, and there's the most initially perplexing moments of the morning of the resurrection. Mary Magdalene is in the garden and sees Jesus raised before he promptly says to her, "Do not hold on to me." John 20:17. It must have been an impossibly hard thing to hear. Imagine her shock. Noli me tangere, whatever that means. And yet, this apparent rejection was her turning point. She realizes it was her teacher. Rabboni, she replies. And like all good teachers, he was not insisting she remain indefinitely dependent on him, but that she be free to live in the awareness of her own union with God. I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God, Jesus continues, John 20:18. That to me hit me like a ton of bricks. And I want to know what your thoughts are on that, if you have any.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind is, Jesus came to reconcile us to God. And so as separated from him. So for him, he is a bridge, right? And his resurrection is sort of the culmination of that bridging exercise, but it's to bridge us to God, right? And so, it's, I guess, I'm not sure exactly, what that for her, I guess the other thing that comes to mind is, Christ just coming back to the disciples, including her and others, and then ascending. They've been reconciled, and now it's like a pay it forward thing. So now that I've done this for you, you are to go do this for others, right? So it's a kind of this ignition point for exploding this to a larger degree, which is what happened, right? And so he said, upon this rock I will build this church, talking to Peter, and that came true. So those are a couple things that came to mind. I think there's, kind of that idea of, where it talks about the participation, the reciprocal. The other aspect of it is that it's not just God, I'm sort of like a child to a mother who's just dependent on this child, versus I'm a partner with God. We're participating in this work together. I have agency and ownership in that. I'm not just participating because I'm dependent. I'm actually volitionally, I'm willing to do that. I want to do that. So I think that's the other aspect, is that God doesn't want, he could have made robots, right? But he didn't. He made us humans with agency. And so choosing God and choosing to leverage our agency towards Him and towards that relationship, and then Christ being that bridge, and our appreciation and acceptance of that, and our humility that requires to accept it. I think we're either resisting that, or we're embracing it. It's one or the other.
It's almost like he's saying, um, once you've gotten it, once you've gotten the revelation and even you internalize it, it now lives in your heart. You don't need the teacher anymore. You become the teacher. You become the carrier of the word.
Yeah. So I guess as a visual to kind of think about that, I think about like an electric car, right? The electric car has to be charged every time, right? But imagine if the electric car was permanently fixed to the source where it was always charging,
Right.
in some sort of supernatural way. Maybe that's a way to think about it,
Yeah.
is that we go, and maybe the Catholic parallel is an example, confession. You have to go through confession for a season, and then there's a point where you go directly to God yourself, where you don't necessarily have to go through a human agent. So, so I think there's something about that, but I guess the thing I would push back on, it would simply be, I don't want to say that we don't need God anymore because we've sort of reached this level of conscious, of enlightenment, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it bridges into my next thing I wanted to read you. It says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Matthew was originally underlining that all ethnicities, not just Jews, could be conscious knowers of what Jesus made known. The gospel is not restricted, to my point earlier. He didn't mean that all people must become signed up members, and Christians mustn't rest until that target has been reached. That reading and the title, The Great Commission, seems to have become popular. That reading and the title, The Great Commission, seems to have become popular during the period of the British Empire, when the Anglican Church took on the imperial and imperious task of civilizing the world. The real truth is, much as Jesus downplayed what people made of him in life and concerned himself with transforming their vision to perceive the kingdom in themselves, so too in his death he offers a demonstration that is an invitation. He shows that the main requirement is to be fully human as he was, a state of being that is indifferent to labels, formulations, and tribes, Christian or any other. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So I would say, a couple of things. Like the first thing that comes to mind is, historically speaking, the mission, I think, sometimes gets distorted or or disconnected from what's behind it. So this idea of making disciples of all nations, of all across the globe, historically speaking, it's become more about the mission than the people themselves, right? And so it's about, okay, we've told this person we've given them a Bible and told them about Jesus, and let's move on to the next. And then it's like it's a task. It's not relational in any way. It's completely missed the mark. And so, and I guess I would say there are probably multiple times where that's happened, where it's even been done by force, where Christians or Christians tethered to the state,
Clearly.
have forced people to integrate. I read a book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and they talk about when the I think it was the Spanish went to South America, and they went to the tribal leaders and they gave them a Bible, and the tribal leader threw the Bible. He doesn't know what it is, but to them it was like, well, he's disrespected the Bible, so we must kill him, and all of these tribesmen. But it was just an excuse, just to do what they wanted to do. And so I think that the mission just gets conflated. But in terms of the way that I think of it more as an individual level is, Christ's bridging my relationship with God and his rescuing of me, his restoration of me, his redemption of me is so wonderful, and bringing me into the kingdom, this secret kingdom, God's kingdom. It's such a powerful and wonderful and beautiful thing that goes on into eternity, that I am compelled to carry that story and that message to the next person, right?
Mhm.
And it's not about me doing it as a task. It's because this is such a wonderful thing. Why wouldn't I tell you about it? It's like when I have a child or a birthday party, or I get something, or something, I get a new client, something celebratory. I tell people about it because it's exciting and wonderful.
Yeah,
And I
you
think in
can't
that
not
same
talk.
way, that's how, Christ in our lives is it's a wonderful thing. And so if it's been so wonderful for us, why wouldn't we share it? So I don't know what do you think?
I just thought it was interesting, him helping me understand that what I grew up in. Jason, I grew up in South Alabama, right? Baptists, Methodists. That concept of converting people, almost like there's a quota. You know,
Yeah.
I found that so. I found it so abrasive, and it put me off so much. I rebelled against that big time when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I didn't, and to tie it to that British imperialism period, that makes a lot of sense to me. That they would
Yeah.
conquer the
Yeah.
uncivilized. It wasn't about the revelation and that sense that you were talking about, that you just can't. It's such good news that you can't help but
Mhm.
share it.
And you look at the disciples, they followed Jesus. There wasn't like a moment where they converted. Jesus said, follow me. And they started following him, and some
Right.
followed him for a while, and then they left and they came back, and right. It just happened. They all abandoned him when he went to the cross. And after the resurrection, that's when they all came back. Right. So, and then it was like, okay, and then there was there was, I guess, different levels or progressions of their own evolution in terms of following him and their beliefs. But after that point, then they started sharing, and then the Apostle Paul went out. But there is, there wasn't. If you just look at the disciples and the early Christians, and some of that kind of like what we now call like conversion or converting people, that didn't really happen in the way that it happens in modern day. We've kind of box it in and put it in this thing that people do. But I think the thing that we've lost is that, and I think one of the things it does, it gives us kind of control or a label or a box to put things in. And I think a lot of Christianity, cultural Christianity, just growing up and reading the Bible itself, and then kind of going, well, where did this cultural Christianity fragment come from? This isn't even in the Bible. And there are a lot of things, and I think that's where some of the self-healing can happen. Is I read the scriptures, the New Testament, and then I look at the church that I'm in as I'm growing up, and I go, well, there's a disconnect.
Oh.
So I'm going to the source. So I'm not going, if the church is off, then I need to reconcile that and push back. But there is, there's a comfort in that kind of certainty of knowing everything and having it all figured out. And I think some things we just don't know, or we can't know. But I think the important stuff we can know, and we can have good reasons to know that. And
Well, one of the things that
yeah,
really caught my attention was his distinction between morality and virtue. Do you remember
okay,
that?
I don't.
Actually, maybe that was Barfield. Actually, I think it was Barfield.
Okay,
Oh, no. It was Vernon. But him talking about morality being, the thing. Well, I should let this person go in front of me because that's the nice thing to do. Whereas virtue, he who is first shall be last. Turning that around and seeing it through the prism of being a virtue allows you to being last, being at the bottom, allows all things to flow through you so that you can know all things.
yeah,
And he goes on and talks about looking at the different commandments as virtues as well: faith, hope, and love. And one of the things that rocked me to my knees was his definition of love. And I almost committed to memory. Love is the extremely difficult realization to see others outside yourself, others outside yourself as real, to see
Mm-hmm.
them as beings in the world, as real beings in the world. And
Mm.
that blew me away. That allowed me to decouple like from love.
Yeah.
Um, I grew up thinking, well, love is this sort of boiling point of like.
Mm.
Start, oh, you have something in common with the person, or you think that girl's cute or whatever, and then all of a sudden you sort of, the pot gets put on the stove and it boils to this point of, now I love this person. They have
Yeah.
nothing to do with each other.
Yeah. And the way that I think about it is that, in a way, love is a choice. It's that revelation you describe, but it's also choosing that. Um, and so I can choose to love someone that is unlovable or unlikable.
Yeah.
Or as even as Christianity kind of takes it to the furthest notch, which is love your enemy and pray for them and serve them and carry their stuff an extra mile, like whatever it might be, and turn the other cheek. But that's the power of what God did for us through Christ, is that he loved me even as I was an enemy of his. And so it wasn't about my likability or even my sin or even my brokenness or my depravity or anything like that. It's that I was made in his image and I was made to be in relationship with him and to be holy. And so he wasn't going to allow me to stay in the state of not that, if unless I chose that, for my own self. But I also have, and that's where the resistance or the embrace, I can either embrace God pursuing me or I can resist him. Right. And so, but I do think sometimes we think of people as ideas or fragments and not as a person, as a spirit, as a person of value,
Seeing them as real. I mean, I had not made that connection just
Yeah.
just then.
Mm,
What you were talking about of seeing it as God's love for me,
yeah.
but seeing someone as real allows me to see someone I detest
Yeah.
as someone who has the same aches and pains that I do, has the same worries and fears and hopes and desires and
Hmm.
everything. Not as someone that's like me, right?
Yeah.
That's similar to me, that shares something with me. It has nothing to do with that. It's the
Hmm.
extremely difficult, and that's key phrase there, extremely difficult realization to see someone outside yourself as real. That blew my.
Yeah. And I even like my brain kind of folds over itself when I try to think about that. 'Cause just the idea of like, why am I me and not you? And why
Yeah.
are you and not me? And just this idea that we're two separate beings, but I'm in my point of view, I'm in my soul, and I'm experiencing the universe through this, and you're experiencing it. I whenever I think about that idea, just it's like almost incomprehensible for
I
me.
never got the to love your enemy,
Mm,
as yourself, love your neighbor. I just couldn't get my mind wrapped around it as a kid, as whatever, until I read that. It's
mm,
extremely difficult realization of seeing someone outside yourself as real,
mhm.
which allows me to see, to act in the best interest of you, of my children, of my
Mhm.
wife, of my customers, of my sworn enemy. And we've all had
Mhm.
people who have egregiously violated whatever
Yeah.
agreement we thought we had with them.
Well,
Uh,
and I going back to your comment about, the concentration camp soldier or the SS soldier, just the idea that that is a person, and and that we are the same, right? As much as we want to distance ourselves from it. When Mel Gibson made The Passion of the Christ, there's a scene, there's a shot where this Roman soldier is nailing Christ's hand to the cross, and Mel Gibson actually did it himself. He was the one in the shot. You just see his hands, And he did that because he recognized that he was just as much that soldier doing to Christ, even though he wasn't literally doing it.
Wow.
And so that was kind of a powerful, thing that I learned from him.
Yeah. I did not know that. I'm going to watch that movie again, knowing that. My last thing I wanted to read you is, and this is a big one for me. There's a central act that acknowledges, nurtures, and perpetuates these tender realignments, the reenactment of the Last Supper. For all who partake of the Eucharist first acknowledge that the man who was born in Bethlehem was of one substance with the Father, and that all things were made by him. And then they take the substance into themselves, together with its representations named bread and wine. The sacrament makes explicit what is implicit. Union with God can be found. It is by revealing this existential bottom line that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father if not through me, John 14:6. I have never understood that. I always understood that verse, no one comes to the Father but through me, as this grappling in my own head with, man, if you don't join the club, you're going to hell, right? And this helped me see that the sacrament of the bread and the wine, taking something that is external and bringing it into yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding that you have the capacity, do this in remembrance of me, do this so that you can remind yourself that you have the capacity to have a union with God.
Yeah.
And it is that principle that I now understand, that he was the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets, if not through me. If you don't understand that, right, that is the narrow gate, the narrow road, the narrow path.
Well, and I guess what I would say is it transcends even understanding. It's also accepting. It's bringing that. It's a symbolic ritual that is also a literal one of, in this bringing of the bread and the wine. It's also symbolic of actually inviting Christ to manifest inside of me, and for me to sort of, in terms of live out that Christness in myself, because he's in me, right? So sort of like allow his spirit to sort of lift me up and to propel me forward. So I think of it as not just an intellectual understanding, but also a very real spiritual thing.
Yeah, well, I never got that until I read that. I never got it reading the Bible. I never got it as a kid. I never got that.
Yeah.
I always thought, oh, okay, well, we do the sacrament here.
It was just a shallow ritual kind of.
Hey, it's like seeing someone with a shirt you used to own or something, you similar. Oh, I used to have that shirt, reminding yourself, keeping concert tickets.
And maybe, when you think about like original participation, maybe that is okay for someone in that stage. Maybe it does come across as superficial, but it actually has a much deeper meaning. I don't know what
Well, for sure. I mean, I always thought of it as a reminder that Jesus died.
Yeah.
That it was the reminder of the event that happened the night before he gave bread and wine, and everybody took it in, and he says, hey, do this in remembrance of me, like as if to remember what happened, as opposed to a ritual to remind yourself that which is external can be internal. That this relationship with God that heretofore had been this separation, this, to the original participation piece where you're, thunder rumbles and you think, oh, that means something, and everybody, to this concept of you can have a relationship with the divine. That which is external can be internal. Take these things and remind yourself of that I did this and I came to show you this. Concept of divine. Take this and remind yourself that you can do that.
Yeah. And I think that's where the idea of God's kingdom transcending the kingdoms of this world is so important, because we are that resident of this much bigger community that transcends time and space as well. And so it's not just about that moment. It's also beyond that moment, I guess, is kind of what.
That revelation, I wanted to call everybody. I want to just go through my phone and just hit dial and just say, let me tell you what I read. I blew my mind.
And they're like thinking, what?
Because I had never understood it like that. I'd never.
But was it the way he said it, or was it just the moment in time, the culmination of everything that kind of led to that moment?
Well, it's just looking at it through a different prism, growing up, we are products of the upbringing we have. It's inevitable. You grew up the way you grew up. You didn't have any choice in that.
Yeah.
And so in order to understand something, you have to have some sort of presupposition about it. In order to transcend it, you have to have some presupposition about it, as opposed to those aha moments that you have that consist of what you didn't know that you didn't know. Well,
yeah.
I know about, making radio commercials. I know enough about bioengineering to know that I don't know much about bioengineering.
Yeah.
And then there's those things that you didn't know that I didn't even know.
The blind spots, or just
right? I'm not talking about those things. That would be like, I didn't even know there was a guy named Jesus. What? That would be almost more powerful, because I didn't have this presupposition. I didn't grow up in this area that I grew up in. I have these religious people trying to say, you're going to go to hell if you do. I would just be like, man, get away from me.
Well, and one of the things, and Andy Stanley talks about this a lot in his book and his messages, but a lot of people that leave Christianity or that abandon their belief in God, when you actually look at the Christianity they grew up with, you look at the God they believed in. I, as a Christian, or Andy, we don't believe in that either. Essentially, they've crafted a version of God or Christianity that is not actually true. And so to shed that is actually a good thing, because you want the real thing. You want the real Christ.
Yeah, well, but you don't know that until you start doing the digging. And some people never dig, man. You don't know that because you don't, you know what you've been taught. One of the things that we were talking about among my family, I thought was a really interesting conversation, was because everybody does this. You do this as a parent, I do this as a parent, and I'm making a supposition that we've never talked about, but I'm assuming this is true because everybody I've ever talked to assumes you get the things that you really loved about how your parents raised you, or how your mom raised you, if you're a single parent, whatever. Your situation, you like, I want to keep that. That's a keeper there. I like that, and then you eschew the things that drove you crazy about your parents. I'm never going to do that. Right. And that happens with everybody.
Yeah.
And so I was asking, we were around the dinner table. I like to ask theoretical questions at the dinner table. And I said, what is it about us that you're going to carry on? And what are you going to jettison, and my 13-year-old really couldn't deal with that question. It was a little bit too esoteric for him. But my 18-year-old said, I'm not going to take my kids to church because all it did was just give me this group of people who were pious and thought they knew best for me. And it wasn't, and I'm totally turned off to church. And I just took them to church because I have my fundamental differences with Methodism, but I took it because it was a community thing. We got together, at least in the name of God, we did, but most of it was kind of a social club, to be honest with you. And I
Yeah.
just thought that was really interesting. And I got where he was coming from because those presuppositions that we grow up with are powerful, man. And some people don't want to
Yeah.
make that. Some people don't want to
Yeah. Yeah.
flip that
Well,
rock over.
and because if you have a bad experience, the alternative is potentially is just to shed that, right? But what's odd about that is that we don't do that in other parts of our lives. We don't, if we have a bad haircut, we don't just say, I'm never going to get a haircut again. We find a new salon or a new barber, right? And so for some reason with church, we can easily dismiss it as all or nothing. But I think for me, what's been great is I've had so many experiences in different denominations of churches throughout my life, that it's given me, I have had positive and negative ones, but all the positives were so positive that the church that we're now involved in, I intentionally chose it because it was the type of church that would give my children and my family the type of teaching and experience and community that I found so valuable. So as opposed to choosing a church, just kind of going to a church, let's say it's a denomination that I've only been to one denomination and I just keep going to that same one. Because I've experienced a variety of them, I was able to kind of know what to look for in a way. And so that helped inform me. But that's probably more of a rare occurrence than it is for most people.
I think so, but I think that the new sort of non-denominational churches, the Louis Giglios and Andy Stanleys of the world, tapped into that.
Yeah.
And
you get a lot of people that were like, I never thought I would go to church again, and now I'm at church.
Yeah, and I'm not sure Andy Stanley wouldn't agree with this, but people look at him like he is the one, the oracle, right? And he is a great pastor, and I have really enjoyed his sermons, but I also want to caution myself, and I'm sure he would too. Like, man, I'm a guy that would, and so, but I think those guys have tapped into that.
Yeah.
That unchurched, shedding the dogma of people like me who grew up going to church, but just totally rebelled in it. And when I tell you I rebelled big time. I did. I just thought it was so inane and so judgmental, and I just went completely away.
But if you had a different experience, it could have changed your trajectory, right?
It would have saved me a lot of. It would have saved me a lot of angst.
Yeah.
And
if you had met Mark Vernon at 17 years old, what would be different?
Mark Vernon would have been able to reach me at that period. I think it happened just exactly like it's supposed to happen, because I wasn't ready to receive that message at 17.
Yeah.
I was a hellion at 17.
Yeah.
I was not a good guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wasn't. I didn't treat people kindly. It was all selfish, self-indulgent stuff, up until well after I had children.
Yeah.
I was going to be the guy. I was going to be the perfect dad, and I wasn't going to rely on anybody, God or anybody was going to do. And I recognized the shortcomings of that.
Yeah.
But had Vernon met me at that point, maybe he could have reached me. I don't know, but there were a lot of people who tried to reach me, and I just told them how silly they were. And,
yeah.
So I think it kind of happened the way it was meant to happen. I suspect that non-denominational church thing, I think it's going to do like all churches, and it will become corrupt at some level, and it'll get crusty and codify, and people will go because, and people, you're starting to see it now. People go just because they can say they going to church, and they got music, rock music, and lights and everything.
Although that may be changing as our culture becomes more secular. So one of the things I heard was there's been a trend in terms of attendance at church declining over the years, and the pandemic has essentially fast forwarded that. So what we would have seen in 3 or 4 or 5 years from now is actually happening now. But there's also other trends, positive ones, in terms of there's a lot of people that are in those seasons where they are looking for answers. And so I think the thing that I like that's so comforting for me in terms of Christ in his transcendent kingdom is that, I mean, one, it's not a surprise, but two, he's not, he doesn't need any single church to live out his mission and his love. So if one church rises and falls, there'll be a new church, there'll be a new community. And so the church is a movement. It's not a building.
Yeah. When I read that passage from the book earlier, that's what I was thinking about was, it's almost like you could hear him saying, wait, don't start another church. No, don't start a club. Oh, crap. You started a club. Oh, it was almost like in him saying, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or Gentile or whatever. This revelation is available to you. It is available to everybody.
Yeah.
And then what we do, we go and we corrupt it. We codify it and we become the club, and then the club, goes along for a while and it just devolves into a mess. And then someone comes along and blows up that mess, a Martin Luther or somebody, now Andy Stanley, blows up that mess. And then it motivates people and moves them, and then we move along, and then it does the same thing.
And even like when North Point, I love what they're doing, but you have other churches that are mimicking some of the stuff. Yeah. But a lot of times they mimic the superficial and they miss what's underneath it.
Yeah.
And so it's there's always going to be these kind of challenges and that's just part of it,
What's the Christian comedian's name? John Cryer, is it, or John
Johnny Christ or something?
Yeah, Christ. Yeah. And he has this funny bit about these two record executives. They're sitting across the table from the Christian band. Have you seen that?
I don't think so.
It's like the formula, like the water. We're going to sing about water, and and it's totally true. All the songs. One of the things as a musician myself, as a bluegrass musician who plays the guitar and the mandolin, part of that, the music that people love, that North Point rock and roll thing, I'm like, that's not my favorite part. I go to hear the word. I'm not much on music, but because of that, because it's super formulaic.
Yeah.
It just sounds the same, but other people dig it, man. I dig it. They dig it. And I like that they're trying to, use a medium that's a little bit more contemporary than, Wesleyan hymns,
for the next gen.
I get it, but it is very formulaic, and, you can go to Giglio's church, you can go to any of the Andy Stanley church, they're all the same. Our church started a praise band, and they play the same stuff. It's that, and that's cool for everybody else, but it's not what inspires me. And that's you can see the church sort of crusting over with that. And okay, well, this is what we need. Okay, we got the lights. Okay, well, we got the really great sound system. Okay, all right, now we can start a church.
And they superficial that they miss the underlying what's informing that. Yeah. So, well, let's wrap up the conversation here. What were your kind of concluding words be about the book, and anything else you want to share that you didn't already?
I just think I've thought about it a lot. I can't believe this book is not a runaway bestseller because of what you were talking about. People are looking, they're searching. The pandemic has really rocked everybody's world, and there's a lot of people wondering why I'm here. What am I doing? What's my purpose?
Yeah. And I think, that identity thing I think is really big. And I think a lot of people are getting sucked into really toxic outlets instead of good ones.
Yeah, agreed. And this, for someone like me who's out there that might need that intellectual approach. I'm not an intellectual, but it has to make sense logically to me. It has to have some logical meat on the bone. There has to be a method to it, and there has to be and this really gives you the understanding of how consciousness itself evolved over time. And I really dug that. I think that's one of the more revelatory things I've ever come in contact with, and so much so that I've gone on to the guy that inspired this book, Owen Barfield. I've gone on and read his stuff. And you talk about some dense stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of 50-cent words, as my mom would say.
Do you have a favorite of his? If someone wanted to start reading Owen Barfield, what would you tell them to start with?
Well, the one I'm reading right now is a collection of essays called reimagining the meaning, or I can't even remember the title of it, but it's a group of essays on the evolution of meaning, essentially. I wish I had it sitting here with me. I don't.
Yeah.
So
Well, I'll find the link.
this
Yeah.
one I have on my Kindle, and then others. I knew the Barfield book. I ordered it from Amazon in nice paper form because I knew I was going to dog ear it.
Yeah.
You know, dense stuff, and I want to be able to go back and remember where I was when I was reading. And it's not something you can not something you can listen to. Some books you can listen to and get along with. This one I listened to a lot as I read as well. I downloaded both.
So is there anyone that you've, like, have you tried to share it with anyone? Any success on getting people to read A Secret History of Christianity?
Oh, I've forwarded it to several people, but you know what? It's probably like the same way. When I hired you as our consultant to help us with our business and we started talking, I clearly I wanted to hire somebody younger than us who's tapped into a consciousness that we're not. And I'm really grateful for that. And I'm looking forward to our future working relationship. But when we connected on works like this, it really sparked me. And since then, I've sent it to people that I know would get it.
Yeah.
You know, there's other people that I know they're not going to read it. So why waste my time? So they have to have a level of seeking and a level of consciousness that would allow them to be curious enough and respect my opinion enough on these things. I'm a bit of a flighty guy, and I go off on tangents all the time and go way down rabbit holes.
Yeah.
You know, read 5 books about a subject that, as my wife says, no one cares about that, right? but the people that fit that criteria, I've sent it to several people.
Yeah.
I hope they read it too. I've sent little passages just to tease people.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Well, this will be another opportunity for us to share it. So thank you for sharing your feedback. And anything else?
Yeah, I appreciate you inviting me to have the conversation. It took a while to get rolling, but I thought it was a good one, and I appreciate your insight for sure.
All right. Sounds good. You're welcome.
See you.